Feel. A little girl points across a gleaming black car, and the woman in red covers her mouth. Her father only smiles. An $800 car has entered a room of polished people, carrying something they never expected to answer for. What did they bury? First thing Jonah noticed was not the car, it was Nora's hand tightening around two of his fingers. They stood near the back of a salvage warehouse, on the outer edge of Detroit. Forklifts coughed through dust, and men in work jackets called prices over the noise. Rows of dented doors, cracked bumpers, burned wiring harnesses, and stripped battery trays sat under long metal lights. Freezing in lace had already disappointed somebody. That was why Jonah had come. Disappointment was cheaper than new parts. Nora stayed close to his side, her small shoulder brushing his leg whenever someone pushed past. Did not complain about the noise. She never did. At 7, she had learned the quiet habits of a child raised around grease, invoices, and men who spoke more with their hands than their mouths. Vivi had a list folded in his shirt pocket, a harness connector, 2 controller housings. Anything he could clean, test, and use before another customer asked why a repair was taking so long. Finish the cash twice before they left the old shop that morning, then once more in the truck, though he already knew what was there, not enough for mistakes. A forklift backed away near the far wall, feeling a blackened vehicle frame sitting on a low pallet. It was not whole enough to be called a car. Not anymore. The outer panels were scorched. One side had been stripped down so far that the inner ribs showed through. The section of the cabin had collapsed inward, and the front assembly hung crooked, as if the machine had tried to fold around its own shame. A man beside Jonah gave a short laugh and moved on. Scrap, he said to no one in particular. Jonah glanced at it, then looked away. He had no room for a project. He barely had room for the jobs already waiting behind Earl's shop. A burned frame meant hours. Hours meant money lost. He lost meant another week of stretching groceries, postponing bills, and telling Nora that things were fine because she was too young to carry the truth. He turned back toward a bin of used connectors. But Nora did not move. He felt the pull of her hand before he saw her face. She was staring at the black frame with the stillness she had whenever something in the world stopped making sense to her. Jonah followed her gaze. "What is it?" he asked, and did not answer right away. She stepped half a pace forward, not enough to leave him, only enough to see past a hanging strip of melted insulation. Her eyes fixed on a small mark near the lower edge of the frame, hidden beneath soot. "That," she said. Jonah crouched beside her. The concrete was cold through the knee of his work pants. He wiped the edge of the frame with his thumb, expecting a stamped number, a shop mark, nothing at all. The soot smeared away. Under it was a small symbol, not a logo, not a standard manufacturing code. 3 short lines curved into one another, simple enough that most people would have missed it. Ona did not miss Nora's reaction. She swallowed. Mom drew that. The warehouse noise seemed to move farther away. Jonah kept his hand on the frame. He did not look at Nora yet. If he looked too fast, she would see the thing that passed through him. And he had spent too many years making sure his daughter did not have to stand inside his old pain. "You sure?" he asked. Nora nodded. "In the blue notebook. Feel Hoon. The one you keep in the top drawer." He should have told her she was mistaken. He should have stood, taken her to the connector bins, and left the burned frame to someone who needed scrap weight. The shape under his thumb had already opened a door in his mind. And behind that door were drawings he had not touched in years, a woman's careful handwriting, and a life he had trained himself not to speak about. Before dinner, he wiped the mark again. It stayed there. A warehouse worker came over with a clipboard. "You looking at that one?" Jonah stood. "Maybe. Not much left on it," the man said. "Came through a storage cleanout. No clean paperwork. For metal. Maybe some housings if you're lucky." Jonah looked over the frame again. This time not as a father trying to walk away, but as a technician. The fire damage was ugly, but ugliness was not the same as useless. The shell had suffered. The interior was gone. But some of the protected runs beneath the side rail looked less ruined than they should have been. A sealed compartment near the lower control area had warped at the edges, split. Nora watched his face. He felt it and forced himself to turn away first. "We came for small parts, I know," she said. There was no pleading in her voice. That made it worse. The worker tapped the clipboard against his thigh. 800 takes it off the floor today. Jonah almost laughed, because $800 was not small money in his life. It was groceries, utilities, Art Earl had been telling him not to put off. It was the kind of number that could make a responsible man walk away without regret. But Nora was still looking at the mark. And Jonah, against every careful rule he had lived by, heard himself say, "I'll take it." By late afternoon, the frame sat in the narrow bay behind Earl Whitcomb's shop, letting black dust onto the concrete like it had brought a piece of the warehouse with it. Earl stood with both hands on his hips, his face fixed in the hard expression he used when worry was easier to disguise as irritation. "Earned shell," Earl said. "I bought usable material. You bought trouble with wheels missing." Jonah did not answer. He helped guide the pallet jack while the driver lowered the frame near the back wall. Fa stood by the office door, with her backpack held against her chest, watching as if the frame might say something if everyone got quiet enough. Earl looked from the frame to the child, then back to Jonah. His voice dropped. "The job's waiting. I know. You got rent waiting too. I know that." Earl waited for more. Jonah gave him nothing. That was how most conversations ended with Jonah, when they got too close to the place he kept sealed. The driver left, the shop settled into its evening quiet. The front bay smelled of oil and old rubber. A customer's sedan sat half-lifted near the door. Nora did her homework at a small desk in the office. Though Jonah noticed, she kept turning her head toward the black frame. He told himself he would only inspect it for salvage. 10 minutes. 15 at most. Enough to prove to himself that the purchase had been foolish but manageable. He brought over a work light, clipped it to the side rail, and knelt beside the control compartment he had noticed earlier. The screws were heat-warped, but not fused. He worked slowly, choosing pressure over force, the way he always did when something resisted without being broken. Earl passed once, saw the tools laid out, and muttered something about stubborn men and bad math. Jonah let him mutter. First panel came loose just after the shop lights clicked into their evening hum. Inside, the compartment was dirty, but intact. Jonah reached in with a small flashlight, then stopped there, and beneath a layer of ash and melted casing, a tiny indicator lens sat dark but uncracked. His pulse changed. He cleaned the contact, connected a low test lead, and waited for nothing. Nothing would have been easier. Would have let him close the panel, strip the frame, and tell Nora the mark had only looked familiar. A faint green pulse blinked once. Then again. Jonah did not move. From the office doorway, Nora whispered, "Dad?" Kept his eyes on the little light glowing inside the dead black frame. "Go get Earl," he said quietly, "and don't touch anything." Earl came out of the office with Nora at his side, wiping his hands on a rag, though he had not been working on anything. The little green pulse inside the black frame blinked again before he reached Jonah's shoulder. For a few seconds, none of them spoke. "That thing has power?" Earl asked. "It shouldn't," Jonah said. He did not say more. He kept the test lead steady with one hand and held the flashlight with the other, careful not to touch the warped casing around the small sealed unit. The compartment was narrow, buried low in the frame, where fire had blackened everything around it. Most men would have pried it open and ruined whatever was left. Jonah simply stared at it, reading the shape of the damage, the heat pattern, the way the seal had bent but not failed. Earl leaned closer, then pulled back. "Tell me, you're not about to spend the night chasing ghosts." Jonah's jaw tightened. "I'm going to find out what it is, the same as finding out what it costs you." Nora stood in the doorway, her hands folded around the strap of her backpack. She looked from Earl to her father, then to the black frame. "Is it broken?" Burned. The test lead off before answering. Not all the way. That was enough for her. She went back into the office without another word, but she left the door open. The shop grew quieter after that. Earl locked the front bay, shut down the lift, and left Jonah with a warning look that said more than a speech would have. Jonah understood it. Earl had watched him build a life out of work orders, second-hand parts, and silence. He knew how little room in that life for old wounds. But Jonah stayed. He removed the surrounding panel one screw at a time. When a screw resisted, he did not force it. He worked oil into the threads and waited. He cleaned soot away with a soft brush. He marked each wire with tape before moving it. The module came free close to midnight, no larger than a paperback book, black at the edges, heavier than it looked. On the casing, beneath a smear of ash, he found the same small symbol Nora had seen on the frame. This time, he did not touch it right away. The blue notebook was in the locked drawer of his workbench. He took it out only after checking that Nora had fallen asleep on the office couch. The cover was bent at the corners. Inside were sketches, measurements, small corrections written in neat lines, same mark drawn in the margin beside designs. Elise had cared about enough to revise by hand. Jonah set the module beside the notebook. The two marks matched. He sat back in the chair. The shop light hummed above him. Somewhere behind the wall, an old pipe ticked as it cooled. He had spent years making sure his memories of Elise came in safe pieces. The way she sharpened pencils with a knife because she hated cheap sharpeners. The way she tapped it twice before calling a drawing. Finished the way Nora had once fallen asleep against her while she reviewed a design at the kitchen table. He had not allowed himself to remember the rest. The conference room, not the closed doors. Not the language that turned blame into procedure and grief into paperwork. The old reader was in a cabinet beneath a box of cracked gauges. Jonah had kept it because throwing it away had felt too final. He connected it to a shop battery, then to the module, and waited through 2 failed attempts before the screen gave a dull flicker. Came back in just before dawn with 2 paper cups of coffee. "You're still here," he said. Jonah did not look up. "It's still reading." Earl set 1 cup near him. "That doesn't mean you have to." A line of text appeared on the screen. Then, another. Most of it was broken, fragments of test cycles and timestamps, strings of system checks that would have meant nothing to a customer and too much to Jonah. He scrolled slowly. He copied what he could. He did not trust the reader, so he saved the raw files twice, then wrote down the visible sequence numbers in a pad by hand. Earl watched him for a minute. "You look like found a snake under the floorboards." Jonah's fingers stopped on the keyboard. The file on the screen was a test authorization. It was not complete, but enough remained. A run parameter had been raised beyond the safety limit. A warning had been logged. A secondary note had objected. The objection carried Elise's design tag. Jonah read it once, then again. His face did not change. The room seemed to lose warmth. Earl lowered his voice. "What is it?" Jonah turned the screen slightly, not enough for Nora to see if she woke, only enough for Earl to read the headings. Earl's mouth pressed flat. "From the old job?" Jonah nodded. "The one they pinned on you?" Jonah did not answer. He scrolled farther. Another file opened, after a delay long enough to make him think it had failed. This one held a protective system note, backup path, and a design reference that should have been gone with everything else. Elise's initials appeared beside a block of safety logic. There she was, not as a photograph, not as a memory, but as work, careful, exact, live in the only way a lost engineer could still be alive inside a machine. Jonah stood too quickly and had to put one hand on the bench. Earl reached out, then stopped himself before touching him. "You need to breathe," Earl said. "No, you're working. That ain't the same thing." From the office, Nora stirred. Jonah closed the laptop halfway, not from secrecy, but from instinct. He had protected her from this part of his life for so long that his body moved before his mind did. Nora appeared in the doorway with sleep-flattened hair and his old shop jacket around her shoulders. She looked at the module, at the blue notebook lying open beside it. "That's Mom's," she said. Jonah closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, he made his voice steady. "Yes. Was it really hers?" He looked at the mark again. Then he looked at his daughter. Part of it was, Nora came closer, but did not touch the bench. She had learned that much from watching him work. Did she fix it? Jonah swallowed. She tried to make it safe, or seemed to settle over the child, not fully understood but felt. She nodded once, as if storing it somewhere important. Later that evening, at their small kitchen table, Ona spread only the pages Nora was allowed to see. The symbol, the harmless drawings, the parts of Elise's work that looked like design instead of accusation. Nora sat across from him with both elbows tucked close, fitting each line like she was afraid looking too fast would make them disappear. She didn't just draw cars, Nora said. No, Jonah said. She built the parts that helped them know when to stop. Nora looked up. Then, why did people forget? Jonah had no simple answer. The truth sat in the other files, the ones he had locked away again after making copies. It sat in words that proved the test had been pushed past a warning. It sat in Elise's buried objection. It sat in the cold realization that his name had carried blame while hers had been erased completely. He reached across the table and turned the notebook gently toward Nora. People count on quiet people. Staying quiet. Nora ran one finger near the little symbol, careful not to touch the ink. Are you going to stay quiet? Jonah looked toward the dark window, where the shop lights reflected faintly from the yard behind Earl's place. He thought of the module wrapped and locked in the metal cabinet. He thought of the copied files hidden in two separate places. He thought of the years he had spent telling himself that peace was the same thing as safety. Then he looked back at Nora. I don't know yet, he said. But that was not true in the way it had been true that morning. Why don't, Jonah, by the time, was back at the bench with the reader connected and the notebook open. The data was not complete, but it was enough to clear a dead woman's name and reopen the one door he had spent years keeping shut. It was enough to prove the frame was not just something he had dragged home from a warehouse, enough to bring them all back. By the next afternoon, Jonah had stopped pretending the files were only files. He had printed nothing he did not need. He had copied nothing without checking it twice. The old reader sat on Earl's workbench beside the wrapped module, and the black frame rested in the rear bay with its scorched edges cleaned, its exposed rails marked in small strips of tape. Thad looked dead in the warehouse, now looked unfinished in a way Jonah could no longer ignore. Earl stood near the bay door, watching Jonah tighten a panel bracket that did not need tightening. You've checked that side 3 times, Earl said. Jonah kept the wrench in place. Then it'd be right. That ain't what I'm talking about. Jonah lowered the wrench but did not turn around. On the bench behind him, the small reader sat in a closed case. Under the case were the copied files. Not all of them, enough. He had learned long ago that truth did not protect itself just because it was true. It had to be carried carefully, especially when the people who buried it still had money, lawyers, and clean voices. Nora sat in the office doorway with the blue notebook on her lap. She was not reading it the way a child read a story. She looked at one page, then another, tracing the air above the paper without touching the ink. The phone rang just after 4. Earl answered, listened for a moment, then looked toward Jonah. His expression changed in a way Jonah did not like. For you. Jonah wiped his hands on a rag and took the receiver. The woman on the line spoke with the careful warmth of someone who had never had to raise her voice to be obeyed. She said her name was Maribel Chase. He said she had heard about the recovered prototype. She said there was an automotive charity gala in Detroit. The following evening, a room full of donors, investors, and people who cared deeply about innovation. He said the vehicle belonged in that room. Jonah let her finish. Then he said, why? There was a small pause, because a story like this deserves attention. A story like what? The return of something people thought was gone, Beale said smoothly. A symbol. A second chance. Jonah looked through the office glass at Nora, still bent over her mother's notebook. Whose second chance? He asked. Another pause, shorter this time. Mr. Hale, this could help everyone involved. That was when Jonah knew the invitation was not an invitation. It was a frame. A polished one expensive enough to make people forget what it was holding. "I'll bring the car," he said. Earl straightened. Maribel's tone brightened. "Wonderful. We'll have a place prepared." "No speeches from me," Jonah said. "That won't be necessary. No one touches the vehicle without my say, of course, and I stand with it." This time, the silence was colder. "As you wish," she said. When Jonah hung up, Earl stared at him as if he had just agreed to walk into bad weather, wearing a paper coat. "You sure about this?" "No, the most honest thing you've said all week." Jonah went back to the bench and opened the case. The reader was small enough to fit in one hand, dull gray, old enough that no one would mistake it for anything impressive. Lee. He checked the cable ends, then the backup drive, then the printed sequence notes he had folded into a plain envelope. Nora came out of the office. "Is that the place with all the fancy people?" Jonah looked at her. "Probably. Is the woman going to be there?" He did not ask which woman. The name Maribel had been printed emails Nora had seen only in pieces, never enough to understand the whole damage, as to remember a face from an old publicity photo tucked inside Elise's papers. "Yes," he said. "She might be." Nora held the notebook tighter. "Can I come?" Earl made a sound under his breath. That. Jonah looked at his daughter for a long moment. Every careful part of him wanted to say no. Keep her in the office. Keep her at home. Keep her away from the lights, the suits, the people who could smile while taking something from you. But the truth in that car belonged to Nora, too. Not the burden of it, not the fight, but the right to stand near her mother's name when it came back into the room. "Stay beside me," he said. The whole time, Nora nodded once. "I will." The gala was held in a private exhibition hall with glass walls, white tablecloths, and cars polished so brightly they seemed less built than displayed, and dark suits leaned close to one another over quiet conversations. Women in evening dresses moved through the room with small smiles and careful eyes. Vehicle stood at the center of the floor, beneath a wash of soft light, its restored body dark and clean, its surface holding the room without giving anything back. Jonah did not look like he belonged there. He knew it before anyone showed him. His jacket was clean but plain. His hands had marks that did not wash out. Nora stood beside him in a simple dress, one hand wrapped around his, the other's sound. He felt her fingers tighten when the first group of guests stopped, looked at the car, and then looked at him, as if trying to match the two things and failing. Maribel crossed the room with Preston Vale at her side. He was smiling before she reached them. "Jonah," she said, using his first name as though they had parted kindly. "You've done remarkable work." He did not offer his hand. The car did most of the talking. Preston's smile was smaller. "We're all excited to understand exactly what we're looking at." "You will," Jonah said. Maribel's eyes moved to Nora, then to the car, then back to Jonah. "And this must be your daughter." Did not answer. Jonah felt the room pressing in, not loudly, but with attention. Phones lifted. Guests drifted closer. Maribel turned slightly, arranging herself so the car, the cameras, and Jonah all fell into a neat little picture she could control. "This vehicle represents resilience," she said to the nearest cluster of guests. "A piece of technology once lost, it now recovered through private dedication and community support." Jonah opened his mouth then closed it. "Not yet." His hand moved to the inside of his jacket, where the reader rested against his ribs. Nora was no longer looking at the car. Her eyes had fixed on Maribel. For a moment, Jonah thought she was frightened. Then he saw her face more clearly. Not fear. Recognition. Nora let go of his hand. He lifted her arm and pointed straight across the polished floor. "That's her," she said softly. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The people nearest them stopped speaking first. Then the next circle. Then the next. Her smile held for 1 second, too long before it broke. Her hand rose to cover her mouth, not in grace, but in shock. Jonah stood beside his daughter and smiled. Calm at last, there, as every eye in the room turned from the black car to the woman who had tried to make it her story. For a moment, the room belonged to a child's finger. Nora's hand stayed lifted, small and steady, till every conversation around the black car fell away. Maribel's hand covered her mouth, and Preston moved half a step toward her, not to comfort her, but to measure how much damage had already been done. Jonah saw it. He had seen men like Preston do that before. They did not look at people first. They looked at consequences. "Mr. Hale," Preston said, his voice low enough to sound private and polished enough to carry, "we should take this discussion somewhere more appropriate." Jonah rested one hand lightly on Nora's shoulder. "No," he said. "This is appropriate." A few guests shifted, vain. Someone near the front lowered a glass without taking a sip. The car stood between them all, black and silent under the lights, no longer a decoration, no longer a recovery story for Maribel to wrap in careful words. Fiona stepped to the driver's side and opened the small, accessed panel he had prepared before leaving Earl's shop. The movement was slow. There was no drama in it. That made the room quieter. He took the old gray reader from inside his jacket, connected the cable, and waited while the screen at the front of the display area flickered awake. Maribel found her voice. "This is not part of the program." Did not look at her. "It is now." Preston turned toward the nearest event staff, but no one moved fast enough to help him. The guests had already become witnesses, and witnesses were harder to manage than donors. First line appeared on the large screen. System archive recovered, then a design reference, then a name. Elise Rowan. Nora's fingers closed around Jonah's sleeve. She did not speak. He only stared at the letters, as if they had been pulled out of the dark and placed where no one could erase them again. Jonah entered the second command. The reader clicked once, and the next file opened. Safety design record, protective threshold objection, override authorization. Most of the words were plain enough for any person in that room to understand. The system had warned them. The warning had been overruled. Elise had objected. Someone above her had pushed forward anyway. Preston's face hardened. "These records require context," he said. "Technical material can be misleading without proper review." Jonah finally turned to him. "Why I brought the raw sequence files." Another screen opened. This one showed the chain in order. The warning, the objection, the raised limit, the approval. Physically, there was no speech Jonah could have given that would have done what those lines did. He did not accuse. He did not plead. He let the car show the room what had been hidden inside it. Maribel looked smaller now, not physically, in the way people do, when the story they built around themselves breaks at the center. Her eyes moved from the screen to Nora and away again. Earl stood near the rear of the crowd, arms folded, his face still. Fiona saw the old man's jaw work once, and that was enough. Nora whispered, "That's Mom?" Jonah bent just enough for only her to hear. "That's her work." The room did not erupt. It changed more quietly than that. The investors stopped looking at the car like a prize. The guests stopped looking at Jonah like a man who had been allowed into the wrong room. Phones came down. Eyes moved to Preston, then to Maribel, then back to the screen. Preston tried once more. "This matter should be handled through formal channels." Jonah disconnected the reader and placed it on the roof of the car. "It will be." He did not have to say anything else. By the time the gala ended, the polished room had turned cold. Representatives gathered in corners. Investors asked questions no one on Preston's side wanted to answer in public. Maribel left through a side exit without speaking to Jonah, phone pressed to her ear, her face stripped of the shine she had carried into the evening. Preston, Osbent remained longer, but because men like him often mistook staying in the room for staying in control. Bill Earl walked over after most of the crowd had thinned. "You all right?" he asked. Jonah looked at Nora. She was watching the black car, not the people. "Not yet," Jonah said. But closer, followed, did not feel like victory at first. It felt like paperwork, calls, quiet meetings, reviewed records, and careful statements written by people who had once used careful language to bury the truth. But this time, fear. The language had to move the other way. The company reached a settlement. The old test record was corrected. Preston lost the position he had spent years protecting. Thiebel's name disappeared from the circles where she had once shaped stories for powerful people. The files Jonah had carried into the gala were reviewed, copied, and placed where they could no longer be treated as rumor. Lisa's name was restored, not everywhere at once, not with trumpets, but officially, cleanly. In writing, a few months later, the black car stood inside a technology museum in Michigan, behind a low rail, no longer hidden in a warehouse or trapped under someone else's version of events. The plaque beside it was simple. Jonah had read it twice before letting Nora see it. She stood close to the rail, both hands at her sides. The Elise Rowan. Safety systems design. Nora did not cry. She leaned forward a little, her eyes moving carefully over each word, the way she had once studied the blue notebook at the kitchen table. "She's really there," she said, and nodded. His throat tightened, but his voice held. "Yes," Earl, standing behind them, cleared his throat and looked toward the far wall, as if something there needed his attention. After that, he did not go back to the old world that had thrown him away. He opened a small training shop with workbenches, donated tools, and enough room for young people who had been told they were not college material, polished enough, not worth the investment. He taught them to test before replacing, to listen before forcing, to know the difference between a part that had failed and a part that had simply never been understood. One afternoon, after the first class had gone home, Nora found the old gray reader on a shelf above the bench. It was labeled now, like the other tools, but Jonah had not locked it away. "Dad," she asked, "was the car broken?" Jonah looked at the students' benches, at the open tool drawers, at his daughter standing beneath the shop light with her mother's careful eyes. "No," he said. "It was waiting." Nora thought about that, smiled to herself, and ran one finger over the label on the shelf. Jonah turned off the last work light, leaving only the small lamp above the front bench, and for the first time in many long years, the around him did not feel like punishment. It felt like room to begin.